In 1830s America, a simple glass of water was a gamble. Cities relied on stagnant rivers contaminated with sewage, the perfect breeding ground for cholera and typhoid. To stay hydrated without getting sick, American doctors actually told people to drink whiskey instead. Settlers moving west found massive, fertile lands perfect for growing corn. They grew so much of it, they couldn't physically transport the surplus. The solution was distillation. Farmers converted 20 sacks of heavy, perishable corn into a single barrel of whiskey. With new industrial machines speeding up the process, a bottle of whiskey quickly became cheaper than a cup of coffee. This chart tracks the resulting surge in consumption. By 1830, the average American over the age of 15 was drinking 88 bottles of whiskey a year. That is 3 times what people drink today. Factory bells dictated when workers drank, and they drank heavily on the job. Drunk workers regularly lost limbs in machinery or died in accidents. Come Saturday payday, men spent half their wages at the bar, then went home to abuse their wives and children. In New York, 9 out of 10 prisoners had committed their crimes after drinking. Alcohol had evolved from a staple beverage into a systematic threat to the American family and workforce. This was an active, untreated public health crisis, and the country began demanding a way out. Women bore the brunt of this crisis, and they organized. Some took direct physical action. A woman named Carrie Nation, whose husband died of alcohol poisoning, started walking into bars and smashing them to pieces. Within a month, hundreds of women joined her, wrecking 100 saloons across 50 cities. Lawyers and activists channeled that rage into the Anti-Saloon League. They ignored a politician's overall platform and asked one question: will you ban alcohol? If a candidate said yes, they got the vote. If they said no, the League rallied local churches to crush them at the polls. 2 major events tipped the scales nationally. First, the government passed the 16th Amendment, allowing for an income tax. Washington no longer needed to rely on alcohol taxes to survive. Second, America entered World War I. Suddenly, German-American beer brewers were branded as domestic enemies, wasting grain that could be feeding soldiers overseas. The pressure worked. In January 1920, the 18th Amendment took effect, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and transport of intoxicating liquor. Overnight, the 5th largest industry in the United States became illegal. Politicians thought they had legislated the problem out of existence. They successfully dismantled the legal supply chain, but they failed to recognize that a change in the law does not equal a change in human demand. Taking alcohol out of the stores created a massive, immediate economic vacuum. A case of whiskey that cost $5 in Canada could now be sold for $80 in the States. Street thugs and petty thieves looked at those margins and saw a business opportunity rather than a legal barrier. They didn't even have to hide everything they did. The Volstead Act, the law enforcing prohibition, allowed pharmacies to sell alcohol for medical purposes. Doctors gladly took bribes to write prescriptions, leading to 6 million legally prescribed bottles of alcohol handed out during the ban. Then there was the geography problem. The Coast Guard only had jurisdiction up to 3 miles off the American shoreline. Smugglers from the Bahamas and England anchored right on that line, safely in international waters. This massive floating wholesale market became known as rum row. At night, smaller, faster boats would zip out from New York and Boston, buy the crates, and race back to the mainland, completely untouchable. The law's flawed design functioned as a massive wealth transfer mechanism. It took billions of dollars away from legitimate businesses and handed it to a new class of highly organized, millionaire logistical experts. At the top of that new hierarchy was Al Capone. Running the underground alcohol trade in Chicago, his gang pulled in an estimated $60 million a year, about $1 billion today. He became a cultural superstar, richer and more famous than the politicians trying to stop him. With that kind of cash, the mafia didn't have to hide from the law, they bought it. In Chicago, 60% of police officers were members of smuggling gangs. Capone even spent $250,000 to back a corrupt mayoral candidate, using his men to violently rig the election. Meanwhile, the product itself became lethal. To meet demand, bootleggers mixed industrial cleaning alcohol with juice, creating cheap bathtub gin. Sometimes they used paint adulterants. In 1926 alone, 1,200 people in New York City died from toxic liquor, and tens of thousands of Americans suffered from a permanent paralysis known as Jake leg. Despite the danger, drinking became an act of rebellion. Secret basement bars, called speakeasies, opened by the tens of thousands, and the demographic shifted. Women who previously pushed to ban saloons were now socializing, smoking, and drinking in them, turning illegal consumption into a fashionable social statement. The government's attempt to cure a social sickness had instead birthed an era of mass poison, systemic corruption, and organized violence. The violence eventually spilled onto the streets in a way the public couldn't ignore. On February 14, 1929, Al Capone's men disguised themselves as police officers, lined up 7 rival gang members against a wall, and executed them. The St. Valentine's Day massacre shocked the nation. Supporters of the band started realizing the cure was worse than the disease. Wealthy political organizers like Pauline Sabin publicly defected, arguing that a law the public ignored only created stronger, more dangerous criminals. Then, in October 1929, the stock market crashed. 9 million Americans lost their life savings. 15 million lost their jobs. The Great Depression had arrived, and people could barely afford food. The federal government was suddenly starving for tax revenue, while the mafia hoarded billions in untaxed black market profits. The irony was impossible to ignore. The government was broke, but the criminals were richer than ever. Franklin D. Roosevelt campaigned on a pragmatic solution. His New Deal promised to rebuild the economy, and he offered a very specific way to fund it: revive the alcohol industry and tax it. He promised Americans 2 things: bread and beer. Roosevelt won, and he moved fast. By April 1933, it was legal to buy beer again. Shortly after, Congress passed the 21st Amendment, officially repealing Prohibition. It remains the only constitutional amendment ever to be rolled back. The repeal didn't end alcoholism, but it shifted the strategy from prohibition to regulation. Today, the state manages risks through taxes, age limits, and licensing. This framework brings in billions in revenue, yet the underlying health crisis remains. Addiction-related issues still drain an estimated $249 billion from the U.S. economy every year. The 13-year experiment revealed the limits of federal power. It demonstrated that when the government attempts to outlaw a deeply ingrained social habit, it doesn't actually remove the product. It simply ensures that the profits and the resulting influence will belong to the